Everyone, welcome back to Yuri's Box. In this video, I'm going to be answering a YouTube comment. If you like this kind of content, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. And as usual, nothing in this video is financial advice. So, again, this is my way of really saying thank you for interacting, leaving likes, and in this case, commenting. I've already answered done a video like this before. Again, this is my way of saying thank you and the fact that I appreciate, people giving any kind of feedback. Again, if anyone else has any comments, I'll, any comments are really welcome. That's what I'm trying to say. So, in this comment, Thomas makes a few points that I think we can all use to give each other some insight. So the best place to start is really the beginning. So the 06-08 comparison. All right. So Thomas in this case talks about the fact that the timing is a bit off, and the fall is potentially different this time, and also we have different things playing out really. Again, we have tariffs to deal with, and this is something that I've kind of alluded to in previous videos. But whenever I mention the 06-08 cycle, I always make sure to mention the fact that I'm always expecting a deviation. All right, like in the 30-year bond chart, for example, I make the case that the moves that we've seen are quite similar to the moves we saw in the 06-08 cycle. But given the fact that every cycle is different, there will be certain divergences. For instance, one of the last videos I made on the 06-08 comparison with the bond chart was that I potentially indicated the fact that we were just here, the equivalent of being in August of 07. Well, we were fighting to get above the bull market support band, and we eventually failed. We were right here. Now, again, the divergence we got was this one right here, right? We got this huge candle, this huge sell-off in bonds, which on its own, it is a divergence. But contextualized is still something that we indeed saw during the 06-08 cycle. And I pointed out how we saw yields go up during times of increased stress in the system. And I pointed towards Lehman Brothers, where again, we saw yields on the long end go up. Right here, this was the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Yields on the 30-year bond went up by about, 40 basis points, And at the same time, we had the dollar selling off. Where are you? Where are you, dollar? Right here. Okay. Let's go on the weekly. I'm really making it hard for me, dollar. All right, here we are. Right here, the week of September 15th, which is where the start of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the dollar went down by about 4%. All right. And this is something that we've seen today as well. All right. The last 10 days, we've seen the dollar really take a beating. All right. And we've seen yields on the long end pop up by 40 basis points. And again, why do I underscore this particular event? Because again, I come back to the fact that I'm expecting things to diverge, because each cycle is different, and I'm definitely not expecting Bear Stearns to collapse again in a week's time. Maybe, who knows? Maybe we'll get it. I don't know. But the idea that I want to put forth when comparing this cycle to the 06-08 cycle is the fact that some underlying events are similar. Not necessarily the way it is playing out, and I'm I've been expecting, and talking about the fact that I was expecting divergences. And again, I'll make another video as soon as I can find some time to do it on on an update on the 0608 cycle comparison on the 30-year bond. So again, it's rather than looking at the the on surface level on the direct price action, I'm pointing more towards the underlying some of the underlying features that we saw in the 0608 cycle, which number one is what I just pointed out. For example, the divergences we saw during times of stress between dollar down and yields up, which we saw again when Lehman Brothers collapsed. We saw when Bear Stearns collapsed, right here. Here. In March of 08, we saw bonds go up and you saw the dollar go down. Something else that is quite relevant to the 0608 cycle is the fact that we have what I call inflation PTSD right now. Back then, we actually had inflation. We didn't even have, the fear of inflation. We had inflation. And again, we had inflation at a time where, stuff was already going bad. I mean, everything was starting to fall apart. In March, we had Bear Stearns, and inflation crept up to 5.6%. And we had some of the same rhetoric we see with rate cuts that we saw last in the 0608 cycle. What do I mean by that? The Fed cut rates in January of 08. And if you go and read, next time I make a video, I'll actually prepare some articles that I found. And really, you'll see how a lot of, mainstream news outlets were screaming at the prospect of the Fed having to raise rates, and that the fact that they cut rates was an incredible mistake. Why? Because inflation was going up. Just to give you, a little tidbit of information, right here, in this time frame right here, Kevin Walsh, who is one of the, possible candidates, to take over from Powell, whether now, hopefully not, or in a year's time, he is on the record for being a hawk. Basically, he wanted to keep on the fight against inflation right here, as inflation went up to 5.6%. And again, that was being on the wrong side of of history, if you will, because again, Lehman Brothers collapsed. The economy was in shambles at that point, and what followed wasn't inflation; it was deflation. Okay, so back then we had inflation and the prospect of having to fight inflation. Today we have the prospect of not having inflation come up again. All right, which I think is quite similar. I mean, there are some differences, but I do see a similarity between our fear of inflation and the fear that people faced in 06 and 08 for, possible inflation. And, the stagflation scenario and, all the doomsday posting that, probably would have accompanied them if they had social media in 08. Moving on. So this is, I know potentially this isn't, this is kind of me extrapolating a lot out of the first part, but I think it's worthwhile to, talk about these things while we're at it. The second part of the comment is tariffs. And what I will say about tariffs is that personally, I do not completely agree with the way it was all orchestrated, because you had a maximalist approach, which inevitably had to be walked back. And we are now at the stage where we could have easily have started off, and the US probably would have, avoided, pissing off half of the world in the process. Now, what you could say to that is that we are at a point potentially where you're not going to, sever everyone straight without, cracking the whip, all right, so to speak. However, I do want to point something out. And this time I'm not going to go back to '06 and '08, but I'm going to go back to 2018. Because I think that COVID kind of just erased our memory, I think. I think that we are so used to, the speed of things that we saw in COVID, like, immediate response against, crisis. You see the Fed responding immediately, bring out the money printer, we need to act quickly. The reality of things is that things take a lot of time. And things before COVID used to take a lot of time. And honestly, when it comes down to the rhetoric, I kind of want to point to, again, something that we're seeing right now, a maximalist approach. And I bring two examples for this. First example is the Trump's Fire and Fury small 50-second speech, I think it was, against North Korea. All right, and I remember this precisely because at the time, I still wasn't involved in financial markets and so on, but I do remember there being absolute panic. All right, because people were saying, "No, this is the exact opposite thing of what we need. We need a cool head. We don't need, we don't need to inflame, the rhetoric. We just need to keep things calm." And everyone was losing their minds basically at what Trump said against Kim Jong-un. But things worked out relatively okay. I mean, a few months went by and they were having lunch together at the 47th parallel, whatever, I forget what parallel it is actually. But in any case, they were having meetings and, Trump actually brokered, if I'm not mistaken, the first meeting between South Korean and North Korean officials after the war. Now, again, this isn't me putting on my MAGA hat. I'm just saying that when it comes down to Donald Trump, and this is something that I keep reminding myself this. I tell myself this in the mirror. When it comes down to Donald Trump, you really have to look at the end result. And you have to try your best to ignore the methods. Because usually the methods are a tornado of a lot of things. And it's easy to get lost in them. And again, if you're a Democrat and if you don't agree with Trump, what you might easily answer to that is that, yeah, by the time I see the end result, I'm popping the cyanide. And that's absolutely fair. But as far as trying to keep a cool head and a level head, what I will say is that we are not new to maximalist approaches, especially when it comes down to Trump. And this North Korean event is definitely an example. But actually, a more relevant example is the trade war that Donald Trump began waging against China in July of 2018. In July of 2018, we have the beginning of the trade war. And what followed that is this tit for tat, and this lasted for 5 months. All right. It lasted for at least 5 months until December of 2018, when Xi and Trump basically, call it quits. Let's stop talking. After that, we still had, definite, shenanigans going on. But what followed was really China and the US eventually meeting, signing trade deals, and coming to the table. All right, and this wasn't an immediate affair. This didn't resolve itself in a matter of a month, 2 months, a week. This went on until 2020, and it arguably is still going strong again. And again, this didn't really resolve much. I mean, at the end of the day, we still have tariffs, and arguably now we're escalating. But this is just to say that this isn't new. It will take a while. I still try to maintain an optimistic approach to the current tariff affairs. And to answer really, some of the first things like, going after against, practically all the world, as Thomas rightfully says, probably I don't know, I mean, I'm talking to you now, Thomas. I don't know your personal opinion on how he went about it, but I do actually think that I wouldn't have potentially gone in that direction. All right, I think that I was expecting some kind of a maximalist approach, if you watched my previous videos, but not as bad as this, okay? So, and again, this is just to point out a few examples of how Trump behaves, and it's not going to be straightforward. And yes, it will have its effect on the economy, which, again, as I definitely agree that there is going to be a so-called detox period, and this leads me to something that I've talked about in my previous videos. I won't get too bogged down to it, but really I think that when asking the question, what effect will tariffs have on the economy? All right, so will actually say, to further elaborate, will Powell have, a harder time with lowering rates potentially because of inflation? I mean, because of tariffs, and because the inflation associated with tariffs. And again, here when you say inflation from that will be less than temporary, and again, companies will go bankrupt. This is actually something that I was just about to move on to, because again, this is trying to answer the question: will tariffs be inflationary or potentially deflationary, and why the hell would they be deflationary? To keep things short, it really comes down to the state of the economy, in my opinion. Overall, tariffs are a tax. And whenever you tax something, you're lowering demand. All right? I'll give you a very simple example. I'm recording this on a MacBook. Currently, a MacBook costs about $1,000, something like that. I'm the leader of the world, and I put a 100% tariff on MacBooks. So again, MacBooks cost double, $2,000. What will that do to demand? It'll kill off a lot of people that possibly could afford before the tariffs a MacBook, and a lot less people will be able to buy a MacBook. All right, so that's the first thing you have to keep in mind. Second, the only way tariffs can be really sustained is if you have a labor market that is red hot. And I think that the best way to keep things short is just by looking at something like the quits rate. If you see people voluntarily quitting their job, people are telling you that the economy is red hot. People have the ability of increasing their wages, meaning that they can keep up with inflation, and actually any inflationary input will just be absorbed, meaning that prices will just keep going up. If on the other hand you have the quits rate being at cycle lows, people are telling you economy ain't doing so great, I'm staying put, meaning wage growth will be a bit more stagnant compared to, or really remain sluggish as opposed to what you saw what you would see when the quits rate is on the rise. And therefore, any increase in inflation, any inflationary bout, any bout of inflation will likely be deflationary. All right, because people will most likely just quit. They're just gonna say, I can't do it anymore, can't afford it, can't do it. And in the case they absolutely must purchase something, let's say a car. Let's as a you know as an example, let's say you're the American consumer who has, let's say, something like $10,000 at the end of each month. Just something, some arbitrary number, and you have to buy a car because you can't just refuse to buy a car. All right, you have to buy a car because you have to move around, you have to go to work, and so on and so forth. Before tariffs, the down payment was 5,000. And in scenario A, with no tariffs, you go to the car dealership and you buy a car and you give the 5,000. You have 5,000 left out of the 10,000 total, that you have left at the end of the month to spend for everything else. All right. So with that extra 5,000 that is left over, you can go to cinemas, restaurants, or whatever. Scenario B, you have tariffs slapped on, and instead of costing 5,000, now the car costs 7,500, so $2,500 more. You're using more money for the same amount of goods, which leaves you with less money at the end of the month to spend on everything else. So with tariffs, you have people actually less money circulating in the economy. Let's put it like that, because again, before you had $5,000, now you have exactly half. So you're not going to go to restaurants as much. You're not going to go to cinemas as much. You're not going to spend it on services as much as you would before. All right. So this is my basic interpretation of tariffs. And again, I've made many videos on why I think this is the case. I'm expecting tariffs to be actually deflationary, if that actually makes, it sounds ridiculous because you think, prices going up, that would be inflationary. But again, that is the way I'm going about tariffs. So again, as far as the spike mode, what I will say is that I do believe that it will take time. I think that the next checkpoint is next month. Actually, next week, I'll be making a video to update TLT, the long bond, because I think that this week that is coming up now, that starts with April 21st, has the PMI reports coming out from S&P, which will actually give us further insight on the state of the economy. And then, the non-farm payroll report in 2 weeks' time. But overall, I still maintain the outlook I had in February, meaning that it'll take time. My first, again, to use the same word, my first checkpoint, macro checkpoint, is the summer. I want to see how the US economy gets to the summer. And again, it'll just be a matter of assessing step by step. I don't think we'll get to a point where it's like, you get May's non-farm payroll report, or when you have something like, negative 500K on non-farm payrolls. I don't think we'll get to see that kind of, a vertical collapse. I think it'll be a slow grind with occasional spikes. All right, that's I think a good way of putting it. So I'm really meeting you in the middle ground here. So again, it'll be a slow grind as potentially the economy goes back to something that is more similar to summer of 2024, and it leaves behind all the transitory events that we saw occur from September to January. So that is basically where I stand on how things will evolve from here. And that really leaves me down to the final point, which is really Trump v. Powell. I made my opinion clear, and I'll say it now just so I don't have to say it in future videos. The prospect of having Powell removed is the nuclear option, meaning that if we actually get to a point where Trump has the ability to remove Powell from his post, that would be extremely negative for everything. forget, I mean, yeah, of course, bonds would I would imagine easily sell off, and we would be easily on our way to 6 or 7% easily in that scenario. But everything else would sell off potentially. Maybe Bitcoin and gold potentially in that scenario. But it is something that is you can't really bank on, because it's like, again, it's one of those scenarios that I put in the same pile as the people that say, if the internet goes away, what will you do with your Bitcoin? And I say, yeah, if the internet goes away, at that point, it's the end of the world, really. And in the end of the world, you're not asking yourself, what should I buy? Bitcoin, gold, Microsoft stock, or the small caps. The only thing you want in the end of the world is farmable land, a source of water, and a shotgun to defend it all, as I always say. So I'll say it now. If we actually get to that point, that is the nuclear button. All right, that is the nuclear button on financial markets. All right, I said it now. In terms of anything of realistic things, hopefully speaking, of course, Trump v. Powell. There's one element that I think is that I don't hear many people talk about, and I will, I'll tell you guys now. There is such a thing in politics that is key, and that is making responsibility bounce off of you onto someone else. And I think that this is extremely clear. This is exactly what is going on, in my opinion. Because if you recall, in November of 2024, Powell actually said, we're not going to talk politics. We're not going to do politics. Trump gets elected. Actually, that was after Trump gets elected. But in any case, in December, he says, you know what? We have to consider tariffs. This, in my opinion, is just the Fed taking a step back and positioning itself in a favorable position in the case the economy rolls over. Because what is the Fed really telling you when it says, we have to stay put, I can't do anything because the tariffs are way bigger than we thought? All they're telling you, or telling us, is really what they're going to message. And what they're going to message is that whenever we get some kind of rollover, they're going to say, we didn't want to cut rates, but it's this jackass's fault that he raised tariffs, he caused the recession. We didn't want to do it, but it's his fault. And arguably, I think that Trump is at fault here, because potentially he just walked into Powell's, I don't want to call it trap. I just call it just Powell being opportunistic. I think that, if that's a word. And I think that, and what you might ask, well, what could have Trump done to avoid this? And that is quite simple. First off, don't have such a maximalist approach to tariffs, meaning that you and I am against China. With China, do have a harsh approach on your allies, meaning that, maybe you organize a summit, a meeting, whatever, and you give them the prospect of, harsh retaliatory tariffs, but don't put them in place in the first, to start off with. So that is one thing where I see Trump and the Trump administration being at fault. And the second, which is I think the most important, is the fact that Trump is really suffering from his own ego, in my opinion, because one easy thing that he could have done so far is trash the economy, meaning trash talk it. Signal to the public how bad the conditions in the economy actually are. And I don't think he's done a great job of this, because you see this with, oh, this is Biden data and this is Trump data. Whenever you have bad data, that is Biden data, and if it's good data, it's Trump data. What you're doing is you're mudding the waters. All right, you're putting yourself at to some extent on the same level as Biden, and you're making the Biden economy yours to some extent. And I think that is a big mistake, honestly, because it's honestly the simplest and easiest thing to do. You just trash talk the economy, and whatever comes next, it ain't my fault. It's the other guy's fault. All right. So again, at the core of politics, and again, I'm sorry if I know there isn't much action on the on the charts right now, but this is kind of a bit of a rant. Again, at the core of politics, there is the kind of rejecting responsibility. It ain't my fault. It's the other guy's fault. And I think that this is potentially something at play when it comes down to Trump v. Powell. I think that Powell, for now, has kind of the upper hand. He didn't have the upper hand potentially before, April 2nd, but Trump just, gave him, a free lunch, going with that incredibly maximalist approach. And second, he should have just trashed the economy, trash talk the economy more, in my opinion. And now, I'm not saying that was necessarily true to say that, things like we're in a depression, absolutely not. But again, you have the case to make that we are in a slowdown, right? You don't have to make the slowdown yours. If you say, oh, we got, 200K on non-farm payrolls, and I actually saw, members of the administration and Trump himself say, oh, we got 228K on non-farm payrolls. The economy's doing great. No, the economy's not doing great. You're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to say it's that guy's fault. And any moment, we just got here, and at a moment's notice, the economy could crumble. And again, Trump is even a master at doing this. He could, just call it fake news or fake jobs by Biden, whatever nickname he wants to come up with. So, really, to kind of summarize everything, eventually, leaving the nuclear option aside, I do believe that tariffs are deflationary, meaning that they are more likely to hurt economic growth, meaning that eventually yields, both on the short end and the long end, will have to come down. How low they go will really depend on how bad the things get. And there are a lot of things that are at play. I talk about something like the yen carry trade. We could potentially see something like that flare up again, definitely. And I think that the next 2 weeks, could be could mark, as I mentioned in yesterday's video, potentially a decision point for the yen, because we are at the lows, and really anything below 140 is unexpected. There's no man's land at that point. So it'll be curious to see. I hope this kind of answered, was really a good discussion. Again, hopefully I answered everything, and I didn't, drag things too much. And again, if anyone else has any comments, you'd like to leave in the comment section, absolutely, the floor is yours. And if it's the case, I'll definitely make a video like I've made one just now, and I made a video in the past as well. So again, hopefully I answered everything, and if you like this kind of content, consider leaving a like, and I'll see you next time. Bye.